Good day to you. Welcome to the third episode of my new podcast, One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers, which is my adventures and research into living history. I'm your hostess, Caitlin, with 20 plus years experience in sewing and over 12 years experience in living history as a whole. And on this podcast, we're going to explore historic clothing and wardrobes, myth debunking, stories and experiences from living history, and also a little bit about how I've incorporated 19th century ideals into my everyday 21st century life. If any of that sounds interesting to you, consider subscribing or following along so you're notified anytime new episodes are published. So actually I've already done this as a YouTube video. This is going to be basically the same information as the same video. So if you've watched the video, you don't need to watch this as well. But this is going to be the no visuals required version. It's going to give out basically the same info. So I've been studying the 19th century for about 15 years now, and I'm still shocked at how little I know. But I also forget that what I do know is not common knowledge for everyone, and I do feel the need to share it as well as bust a few myths along the way. Again, as a rule from last time, if you've been on this channel, you know that we do not do things like, well, my grandmother told me this is what it was like in her Mother's Day, or I was always told, or this is just information I picked up over the years, or I think that, or anything of that nature. We deal in whole card documentable facts here, primary documentation only. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to use primary sources from the 19th century women who are wearing the clothes and men observing them, as well as primary sources from myself and other living historians who actually do this, and do this very often, to attest to some of these myths. Also, I'm not an expert in 19th and 20th century fabric or dressmaking, or even in history. I didn't go to college for this. I don't do this for a living. I just volunteer, and I have apparently too much time on my hands, so I research things. So today I picked up 3 more myths that we're going to debunk. And these are things I've heard over and over and over again from living historians all the way to the general public, and I just want to touch on them today. The first myth I want to look over today is the myth of the same dress being worn for decades on end. And this is an interesting one because it's technically true. So some women were wearing dresses from 10, 20, 30 years, or even 100 years ago. And I know what you're thinking, but Caitlin, if it's true, then it's not a myth, and we shouldn't be talking about it in a myth-busting video. Well, you're right. But the myth isn't in the statement, it's actually in how our cultures differ from the Western 19th century culture, and more specifically in the meaning of words. So our understanding and our concept of a dress lasting so many years isn't the same concept of a 19th century dress that is lasting that long. And to illustrate this, we're going to imagine I'm wearing an 1860s ball gown. So pretty silk dress with, long skirt worn over crinoline, low neckline, high, short sleeves, okay? So you, the 21st century person there, what would you call what I'm wearing? Well, you'd probably say a gown or a dress. Well, that's great. So now we're going to imagine I'm holding a length of silk fabric. What would you call that? Would you call it just fabric? Would you call it silk, cloth, a length of silk? Now, what if I told you that both of these things in the 19th century were called dresses? And now we're going to pretend I'm wearing an 1880s nightgown, and I'm going to be holding fabric to make a nightgown, right? It's still fabric to become a nightgown, and therefore we might say it's fabric to be a nightgown, but it's still fabric, right? Well, in the 19th century, both of them are nightgowns. So are you confused yet? Garments are called by the intended finished project, regardless of the stage of their construction. Just fabric is still a dress as long as the dress length and of dress goods. We see this illustrated countless times in diaries and stories written about the time. In 1860's The Girl's Birthday Book, which is a collection of stories, we see a story of a little girl named Jenny, who has a rather angry mother, and the child sets off to make her mother new chemises as a present. So she buys the chemises. In our 21st century mind, she has bought up 2 ready-made chemises, right? But in the next paragraph, it says that Jenny's teacher has actually bought them with the money Jenny has earned, and then cuts out the 2 chemises. Now our 21st century minds are reeling because the author had just said they bought chemises, but now they're cutting out cloth to make the chemises? What's going on? Well, this is actually very common because although today it's very common to buy fabric for the sake of buying fabric or because it's pretty, you quilters and other seamstresses know what I'm talking about. We all do it. There's nothing to be ashamed of, and I'm no better than anybody else. But we may not know what the finished garment's going to be when we buy the goods, right? We're buying it because we like it, or it's on sale, or it's going to go with something else that we have, what have you, and we just buy what we think we might need one day. In the 19th century, that rarely happened. You only bought goods when you needed something, and therefore you knew what you were going to do with it. So you could go to the store and order a dress, and the shopkeeper would give you a dress length of fabric. But when you read about someone buying a dress in the early or mid 19th century, they aren't buying a finished dress as we know it. They're buying fabric to make a dress. So if you see references to someone buying someone else a dress in the 19th century, what happened is they bought a dress length of fabric, and then the recipient would have it sent to her dressmaker, or she could have made it up herself, and made up the fabric in the pattern and style that she liked. It was very common to see something to the effect of, oh, Johnny bought me a lavender silk for Christmas, and then 2 weeks later, the dressmaker is at their house making up the lavender silk dress. So just keep that in the back of your mind when you're reading 19th century books and stories. There are 3 types of garments in the mid-19th century as described in a Manual of Domestic Economy suited for families spending £100 to £1,000 a year, published in 1856. It's a British publication. And it says these 3 types of garments are body linen, namely chemises, drawers, petticoats, nightclothes; indoor dress, which is made by a dressmaker or otherwise at home, namely dresses; and an outdoor dress, which includes things that you bought ready-made. And you cannot buy dresses ready-made. So these would be things like mantles, bonnets, veils, shawls, gloves, that sort of thing. Dresses are custom-made to each and every person, regardless of social class. This is something a lot of people have a really hard time with. Dresses are custom. Now, please do not be fooled into thinking that custom means expensive. That is not the case. But all clothes were custom-made. Even if you bought your clothes second-hand, that was still custom-made to the person prior, and you would typically take that dress apart and refit it to you. So you would have a second or third hand or even fourth or fifth hand dress, but it's still made to you. It is a rare day indeed when I examine a mid-19th century garment with 0 signs of alterations, especially if the fabric is nicer. So think silks and wools or very nice cottons. Those are going to be the ones remade over and over and over again. More often than not, when I look at originals, there are clear alterations and sometimes not very well done alterations. We see clothing for what it is today, as a finite, unable to change article. When we shop for clothing, the dress that we buy in our minds is always going to be a dress. It's never going to be anything else, right? The dress will always be a dress. The jeans will always be jeans. We don't see them for the materials they are made of. We only see them for the garment itself. And we have been getting better at seeing things for their potential and not necessarily as for what they are currently. So we can see a dress shirt and see, oh, we can make that into a baby's dress, or we can make a skirt from ripped blue jeans. We would almost never consider taking a dress shirt, taking it apart, or recutting it and making another dress shirt out of it. That would just not cross our minds. And part of that is because our fashions aren't changing as commonly as 19th century fashions changed. Fashion changed all the time in the 19th century. Like seriously, all the time. And we're going to talk about fashionableness in a bit. But for now, let's say the vast majority of people are following within a reasonable degree of fashionableness in their clothing. So taking an older gown and restyling it was totally normal back then and very acceptable. Sometimes every year, sometimes every season, sometimes every year and a half or so. It depended on the person, the style of gown, etc. So kind of as an example, let's say a lady made a dress in 1855, right? It's going to be a black silk dress, very common. And it's going to be probably one of her better dresses. So we're talking like maybe upper working class. She makes a basic round waist, high neck, gauge skirt, gathered waistband, bishop sleeve dress. A typical normal dress. 2 years later, she's had a baby and the dress no longer fits. So she's going to take apart the dress to refit the waist and skirt. She keeps the gauge skirt but decides to dart the waist this time. And there's a fad right now going on for 3 darts in the waist. So she's going to go ahead and do that because, what the heck? I'm already taking this apart. Let's go ahead and do this cool new thing I've been seeing. The skirt gets set back into gauging for her now larger waist after rebalancing the skirt because she has more of a tummy now because of the pregnancy. And she needs a little bit more fabric at the front of the dress to make it even around the hem. Not to mention that everyone's now wearing cage crinolines, and so she needs a few extra inches on the hem to accommodate a hoop. Bishop sleeves were so common, and although not the peak of fashion, we are still seeing them, so she leaves them. She wears the dress occasionally for a year or so, but by 1860 she's had another baby and the hem is getting ratty. So she takes it apart, resets the waist. This time she sets in 2 darts instead of 3 because the 3 dart fad didn't last. She takes out the skirt's facing, engaging, turns the skirt upside down, puts in a new facing at the new hem, folds under the old hem for the waistband, and she decides to pleat the skirt this time because gauging is going out of fashion for silk dresses, and pleating is going to be more common. A few years go by and it's 1863. Bishop sleeves are really out of fashion, especially for nice dresses, but the new coat sleeve is in. We can cut a coat sleeve out of a taken apart bishop sleeve. Also, so the lady decides to remake the black silk, so she takes out the sleeves, put in the new coat sleeves from the old sleeves, and pleated trims are in, so she takes off the old fringe and sets a nice silk trim and a round design around the neckline and the new sleeves. 4 years later is 1866, right? The styles are really starting to change. The old skirt will not fit over the new style of hoop skirt, the elliptical one anyway. So the whole skirt gets taken out. There's a large stain of candle wax that's left its impression, so the fabric gets turned inside out, cut into gores, sewn back together, and the extra pieces from cutting gores goes into lengthening the back, so that it will now fit over an elliptical hoop. The bodice is still reasonably fashionable, but the trim gets taken off and replaced with small silk fringe with a set in a square shape on the bodice and sleeves. Buttoning dresses are all the rage, so the former hooks and eyes are going to be replaced with buttons and buttonholes. Or even we can put fake buttons over top of this buttonholes, depending on how much time we have. Peplum bodices are in, so that's bodices with like a little skirt attached. But alas, no extra fabric to make any, so no matter, it's just black silk. We'll go and buy a half a yard of black silk at the local mercantile store, and we'll make ourselves a peplum. So instead of cutting off the piped edge of the waist bodice, she just cuts off a peplum, lines it, whips it directly to the piped edge without taking anything apart. And we have ourselves a peplum bodice. After putting on more silk fringe at the end, the dress is now perfectly fashionable. And that's just a 10-year span of what could happen to one dress. For complete transparency, this is not a very true story of dress. It is but it has its basis in facts. I do own an original 1860s black silk bodice that was very clearly remade from an earlier bodice. I can see the stitch marks where the former rounded trim was. And yes, that whole peplum story was completely true. Just tacked on there, no true effort really given. And it's definitely a newer fabric. The sheen and the weave is slightly different from the older, parts of the bodice. But if you just look at it, you just see the black silk. So you don't really notice it unless you're looking at it under a magnifying glass or a microscope. And all that talk about taking an early 60s skirt and making it fit over an elliptical hoop, I've done that with my wool morning dress. Going back to our example of the dress that spanned 10 years, it's still a dress, right? It started as a dress and ended as a dress. And then the 19th century person would say it's still the same dress. But if you look at the dress how it started and looked at the dress how it ended, they are totally different dresses to our eye. They look completely different. There's different waist treatment. There's different styles, different trims, different sleeves, completely different skirt shapes, etc. But it's the same dress because it's the same fabric. If you today were looking at the 1855 version and the 1865 version, side by side, you wouldn't see the same dress because they look nothing alike other than their color and fiber. But they are the same dress. So when you come across a period reference, because yes, they do exist, of people saying, oh, I've been wearing the same dress for 10, 20, 30 years ago, just know that they probably have a lot of dresses, because if they didn't, that dress would wear out and it wouldn't have lasted that long. Although we like to say that their fabrics are much better quality and lasted that long, fabric is still fabric. If you're wearing it all the time, it will wear out. And also, B, that dress probably looks nothing like it did 10, 20, 30 years ago. There's an example in the Met of an 1840s dress that was likely made over from a 1740s dress. Fabric was fabric to them, and so as long as it was still strong and could withstand being taken apart and remade, it got reused. But guess what? We would see the 1840s and the 1740s dresses at totally different dresses. But in the 19th century, they're still the same dress. It's just been refreshed. And if one only had 5 or 7 gowns in a given year, how often do they have to be replaced? This is another hard research topic. And sometimes you will read about dresses being retired, but more often than not, they're sold to the peddler or secondhand merchant, and then you're using the funds to buy new fabric or a new secondhand dress, which means we're not getting the full life story of a dress from one person or a diary. But I was still curious as to how long dresses, if you're in the working class and you're doing physical work all the time, how long they're wearing before they just wear out. Maybe you only had 5 to 7 dresses in a year. So I turned to my friends at Barring Living History Farms here in Texas. Barrington is the former plantation and home of Dr. Anson Jones, the last president of the Republic of Texas. It's part of the Washington and Nebraska State Historic Site, and it's a fully functioning living history farm. From Wednesday to Sunday, if you go to Barrington, you will see interpreters in historic dress doing things, living 1850s farm life. It is a core group of people, and they have everything from working with the animals, gardening, cooking, housework, plowing fields. Everything is done how it was done in the 1850s. I am friends with the 3 ladies at Barrington, and I asked them a series of questions about their clothing and the wear and tear they experience. These ladies are wearing historic dress 4 to 5 days out of the week, and so they're just about the closest thing we can get to a 19th century person, right? I did ask if I share these answers in a video, and they said yes, and I really appreciate all 3 of them taking the time to indulge my research craziness. Barb has been doing living history full-time for 27 years, Laura for 7, and Teresa has just started. Now, these are not going to match a 19th century person's reality perfectly, right? These ladies aren't living 1850s all the time, just during working hours, and most of the time they aren't washing their clothes the historic way, which is a lot more abrasive than a modern washing machine, and that would wear out clothes faster. They also only own the clothes that they find necessary, which is not nearly as much as the average 19th century woman would be wearing. Part of this is modern washing. It makes it so convenient that you can just do laundry all the time, and they don't really need as many clothes. And so likely the women of Barrington are going to have their clothes last longer than someone in the 19th century. But to quote Laura, I wear historic clothing at least 4, usually 5 times a week, and do real farm work in it. On any given day, I might be cleaning coops or hoeing the garden, or sometimes plowing, picking cotton, cooking, or just mending. So these ladies are wearing all the layers of a 19th century woman, and that includes chemise, drawers, corset, petticoats, and dress, and doing all these chores and doing this every day. So without further ado, let's get into this. The first question I asked was, how many days a week do you wear historic dress? They all work at the same historic site, so 4 to 5 days a week was the answer for all of them, right? This is unsurprising. They all work at the same place. Question 2 was, how many dresses do you find necessary for what you do? Teresa said that she had 4 work dresses, although one is fancier and she only wears it for special occasions. She also has a wool Christmas dress that she rarely uses. Laura has 1 nice day dress, 2 work dresses, and a short gown and petticoat, or also known as a sack and petticoat by the mid-19th century. She also has a warmer wool dress and plans for a silk evening dress, but she hasn't made it up yet. Barb has at least 3 or 4 dresses that will only last a few years. She washes them once a week unless they're very filthy. Question number 3 was, how many basic undergarments, that's chemises and drawers, do you keep? Teresa says that she keeps 3 chemises and drawers. They actually all said 3 chemises and drawers. Laura says that her chemises disappear a lot, but she likes to have 3, especially in the summer when she's sweating through them every single day. Laura also says she has 3 pairs of flannel drawers and a pair of regular drawers. Doesn't usually wear them unless it is very cold or when it's very hot, so her chemise doesn't stick to her legs. Barb also said that she had 3 sets of chemises and drawers, but she generally wears them for a week at a time. Question 4 was, how long do your clothes last, or how often do you have to replace articles? Teresa had not been at Barrington long enough to replace anything yet. Laura on this subject said that she has a chemise from 7 years ago that's still in good shape except for a patched hole where her hamster chewed through. Laura did say that in her experience, her aprons and work dresses tend to last about 2 years, but her nice day dress is still going strong 7 years later. Barb said that her clothes last her about 4 years, but things like caps, socks, and aprons need to be replaced more often, about once a year. Question 5 was, do you have records of what the average person owned in terms of clothing in your area, and do you try to replicate it, or do you just keep the amount of clothes that you actually personally need? Teresa was still growing her wardrobe and takes direction from Laura and Barb on what she actually needs, because it is a new time period for her. Laura did say she keeps the clothes she personally needs. She does say, and I quote, I've heard the average person had a lot more clothes than you might expect, which I love because that's what we debunked in the last Victorian dress myth-busting video. Barb also says she keeps what she needs plus a nice outfit. Question 6 was, what are some period tricks you do to keep your clothes lasting longer? Teresa said they do a lot of mending and patching and altering. When a dress is falling apart with no hope, it gets repurposed into petticoats or patches. Laura's had a lot of good thoughts on the subject. She said it depends on the dress and color. She's over-dyed dresses before, especially light clothes, but it didn't stick long and it didn't look great even after a few washings. She had a yellow dress that she redyed 2 or 3 different times before it got sent to the rag pile because it was just so raggedy and dingy. So now Laura actually chooses to go for darker colors that won't fade as much. She wears the more broken-in dresses that are lighter and thinner in the summer, which I thought was a really good point I hadn't thought of. Laura had one dress with bell sleeves that she turned the hem in, and another dress that she cut the cuffs off and sewed them back the wrong way out, and the dress lasted another half year or so for her. She also likes to put on hem tape at the bottom of her skirts, or else they'll look bad very quickly. And she also talked about regathering a bodice to make it fit better, but also to make it look less faded. She said that mending and patching is a constant chore, especially on her petticoats, and most things at least last half a year for her before needing to be fixed all the time. Barb mentioned that mending is a monthly task and that she has done all the tricks, including overdying and all the things. Question number 7 was, what do you do with worn out clothes? Are you able to find practical uses for that fabric, or do you just wear things out to where they are in an unusable state? Teresa, being new, hasn't done this yet, but Laura said she does tend to wear out her dresses very well. She said she's tried to make a sunbonnet from a skirt of an old dress, but did not last very long. But she does repurpose dress skirts into petticoats. Barb says she's repurposed clothing into pot holders or clothes for kids to do laundry demonstrations with, and also rags. And that's about wraps up the questions I asked. Again, big thanks to Laura, Teresa, and Barb for helping me out and taking time to answer my crazy questions. And although it isn't exactly the clothes that would have been worn in the day, it's still a great insight into a very close example. They had an average about 3 working dresses apiece, which is very much on the sparse end when you start looking at wardrobes of the 19th century. And of course, the smaller number of dresses you owned, the more each individual dress is going to be worn and therefore wear out faster. You have to replace them faster, right? So the Barrington ladies are probably wearing out their dresses at a faster rate on that account, but they're also wearing their dresses less than the average person because they're only dressing in the 19th century 4 to 5 days a week instead of 7. So you can account for their only wearing 19th century clothes part of the time, but also having half the amount of dresses a woman would have likely owned. I suppose it kind of evens out. But even then, you had to account for how often you wear your dress. Notice how Laura says her work dresses last about 2, but her nice dresses lasted 7 years. Not all dresses are being worn equally, right? And also, that doesn't account for quality materials. Cheap materials don't last very long. You could buy cheap material in the 19th century. I know a lot of people don't think you could. They think that fabric, back then was very nice compared to what we have today. And that can be true. It can also not be true. They had cheap material back then that did not last very long. There's material you could buy that was only expected to last a season. We don't have those examples anymore because they wore out. They were cheap materials. It's always fun when you see dresses being advertised and talked about in the period of certain fabrics, but then you look at extents and there are no extents left, or very few extents left for the amount of times it's being talked about in diaries and shopkeepers' manuals. And you're going, well, there's a disconnect. But you look at the price and you're like, it's a super cheap fabric. It wasn't able to last the 150 years to get to us. But yes, generally, of the fabrics that we have today from the 19th century, they are, in a lot of ways, better than what we have today. But those are the good fabrics. They also had cheap ones. And cheap materials came in all fibers. You could buy cheap cotton. You could buy cheap silk that was not even very much or even at all more expensive than your regular cotton fabric. Certain fibers will last longer than others. So protein fibers, silk, and wool are going to last a whole lot longer than cotton and linen. Linen is going to last a lot longer than cotton. It's just a very strong fiber. So when we think about the dresses that are being worn for 10, 20, 30, or 100 years, we do have to keep in mind that those dresses are not being worn very often, and they are likely remade over many, many, many times. And they're likely going to be of a more expensive fabric because that's going to be what withstands the remaking. But even after all that, it's still technically the same dress by 19th century standards, and remaking dresses was ridiculously common. Our second myth for today we're going to talk about is the fashionableness of clothing and how not all women followed fashion. You may have heard this in several forms, such as if you're poor, you couldn't afford to be fashionable, or like today, not everyone cared about being fashionable, or even out here in insert random state and province or town that is not in the East. It took arbitrary number of months or years to get anything back from the East, so most people were so many years out of fashion because the fashion wasn't coming out here. Or even poor people couldn't afford many dresses, so they're still wearing the same clothes for 10 years ago, which we've already somewhat debunked. So let's return to Mrs. Carrie Williams of the previous myth-busting video, and I love her. As a quick refresher, this is the woman who lived in California with her husband, who was a gold miner. It's the late 1850s, and they're poor enough to be in debt to the peddlers and had to buy most of their goods secondhand, and also selling off pieces of furniture like pianos. but they do seem to be fairly high up on the social scale in their area. Carrie nearly every day wrote about what she was sewing on, and I was able to count the dresses for herself that she talks about either buying or making in this little 1-year window of 1858 to 1859, and that equated to 7 dresses and 3 wrappers. Again, I love this woman. I wish more people wrote diaries like she did. In 1858 in California, buying silk and cashmere, and she has the forethought to casually mention in her diary that she's receiving Godey's Ladies Book, and her friends are following the fashions that are put forth. Not only that, but she is getting and reading other ladies' magazines such as Graham's or Harper's. Again, poor mining town in the middle of California in the 1850s. She gets the December issue of Godey's Ladies Book on the 1st of December of that year. So not out of date at all. And she specifically mentions lending the book out to friends once she has read it and how particular her friends are copying the fashions and keeping up to date. And as far as fashionability, and as we've already discussed, remaking gowns was incredibly common. A particular example of this is Mrs. Williams' mother-in-law. She's an older married woman, she has grown children, and she has grandkids, so this is not a young woman. She's not silly or young, she's older and respectable. And aside from the numerous gowns for herself, Carrie does note of Mrs. Williams' slate merino gown. And Mrs. Pooler had first made the gown 2 years prior. Miss Gibson, who is a local seamstress, which Carrie has hired before to make good fit dresses for herself, made over the gown again, and then it was sold to Carrie's mother-in-law to be finished, and then the elder Mrs. Williams, Carrie's mother-in-law, has just refinished it for herself. So that is 2 remakes in 2 years. It was made 2 years ago, it was refitted and remade over by Miss Gibson, and then it was purchased and remade over again for Mrs. Williams. So let's move on from Carrie and we'll talk about something else. There's a cute little story in Harper's Magazine in 1860 called My Velvet Shoes. It's an adorable story set in 1857. So the story is told from the point of view of a poor bookkeeper in the city who does not have a lot of money. He is married. His wife notices that his shoes are worn and tells him to buy new ones. And before he does, he happens to wake before his wife one morning and notices the state of her hoop skirt, which is just all bent and mangled, and it has been, there's some splices and it's, mended and with, galloon, and then with linen thread, and then some, fractures were mended with other types of wire. And he calculates that she bought that hoop 6 months ago, and it was the regular old-fashioned champagne glass shape. And he figured that had Mrs. Lambswell married someone else besides the poor bookkeeper, she would have had at least 2 sets since then. And what does that tell us? Well, for starters, hoop skirts were changing so rapidly that all but the very poor were keeping up with it and purchasing new hoops every 2 to 3 months. Anyway, the husband buys himself a new... The wife in the story also has at least one silk dress that she does not wear often. But when mentioning this silk dress, it comes out the wife has actually been avoiding town social functions because her hoop shape was so out of fashion. And she did not want to appear in town as unrespectable because of her unfashionable skirt shape. Her husband ends up buying her a very expensive hoop, and she gets excitedly planning out what she's going to wear to a social function after getting her new hoops. And she lets it slide that she hasn't been attending social functions because of not being able to appear respectable. So you see, dressing well and reasonably within fashion shows others that you are a self-respecting, upstanding member of society. If you wanted to appear as the good Christian woman that you were expected to be, you stayed fairly up to date in styles. Now, do not confuse staying in fashion with following fads. We tend to think of them as synonymous, but that is not the case in the 19th century. Fads came and went very quickly, and not everyone followed them. Fads could also be local to a region or a particular town or even a state or an area. Generally speaking, younger women are going to likely follow fads more often than older women, but being respectably fashionable did not equate to blindly following the fads. Looking through photographs, you see that most people stayed within a reasonable amount of fashion, although some very old women, and I'm talking 70 plus, you are not an old woman unless you are 70 plus years old. They did sometimes favor things like the curls from the 1840s and wearing caps, even up into the 1860s. And that's not even a hard fast rule because you do see more fashionable older women. The outliers and people who did not follow fashions were generally treated as outcasts, and you should not expect to show up as out of fashion in the 19th century and be treated well or shunned in town, invited to social functions, etc. You would expect to be ostracized. The only people who get away with dressing so out of fashion and not keeping up with trends are generally very rich old people who had enough money to be the highest in the social circle, and everyone just saw them as quirky. But if you weren't rich, you didn't have that luxury. You don't have to follow fads, but you do have to be reasonably fashionable. And before we let go of this topic, I do want to touch on a few things, mostly that even though we're talking about fashionable versus fads, those aren't necessarily terms used in the 19th century, right? So you would still be called unfashionable even if your dress looked fairly decent, which makes it even more difficult when we're reading this today, right? But even when you read about people who are wearing unfashionable dress, because yeah, I will absolutely admit there are definitely stories and accounts of people wearing old-fashioned dress, but they are generally people who do not fit into society. And this further compounds when you think about, because there is a lot of literature on people in the country having different fashions than people in the city, and that country people don't appear the same way as city folk. Well, the city folk would say the country folk were unfashionable, but the country folk are still following their own form of fashion. They would consider themselves fashionable in their own towns, and if you would deviate from their type of fashion, you'd be ostracized by the country folk. So it's a very nuanced, difficult concept to speak on. But even Eliza Leslie, she wrote a lot of behavior books, really starting in the 1830s and going on through the mid-19th century, and she speaks of this too, saying things such as, it's bad form if you are from the city and after accepting kindness from country people are ashamed to recognize them if they come to town on account of their unfashionable or rustic dress. She says it's very vulgar to do that and is foolish pride. But she also says there's no danger of plain country people being mistaken for vulgar city people. So plain country folk are going to have a sort of modesty and rusticness about them to the point where they're not vulgar, unfashionable, city people. They're unfashionable in a quaint way, which you do see illustrated in other literature as well. And going back to, some people were meant to dress unfashionably to appear different from society. Think of the Quakers. There is a book by Thomas Lowe Nichols in 1864 called 40 Years of American Life. It describes the Quaker women as women, young and old, ugly and pretty, dressed in the same quaint and most unfashionable attire. There are no bright colors, no ruffles or flounces or frills, no embroidery or laces, no ribbons or ornaments of any kind. The hair is combed smoothly back under a plain cap, a three-cornered kerchief of a sober brown covers the bosom, and the narrow gored skirt has no room for crinoline underneath. But that's part of being Quaker, right? They're the plain folk. You're supposed to appear unfashionable and plain, and you're supposed to be apart from society. So their unfashionable attire sets them apart from society. But if you dress differently than society deems acceptable, again, you ought to expect to be treated as someone outside of the social norms. So Dress is a Fine Art by Mary Philadelphia Merrifield, which was published in 1854, says specifically, the subject of economy and dress, an essential object with many persons, now claims our attention. We venture to offer a few remarks on this head. Our first recommendation is to have but a few dresses at a time, and those extremely good. If we have but a few dresses, we wear them and we wear them out while they are still in fashion. But if we have many dresses at once, some of them become quite old-fashioned before we have done with them. If we are rich enough to afford this sacrifice, the old-fashioned dress is got rid of. If not, we must be content to appear in a fashion that has long been superseded, and we look as though we have come out of the tombs, or as one of our ancestors has stepped out of her picture frame and again walked the earth. There's also different forms of unfashionable dress. Consider the reform dress that is popularized starting in the mid-19th century, so 1850s really, and that is the style of Amelia Bloomer, so the women who are beginning to wear pants. That is still considered very unfashionable dress, right? So the Health Reformer that is published in 1870 has this to say about it. And it says, but here and there, a few women braving the sentiment of the street have appeared in unfashionable dress in the costume that is comfortable, wholesome, convenient, useful, modest, and economical, and which no one has ever, nor ever can, say aught against, except that it is unfashionable. And how have these women been received in society? Had they been commended, applauded, rewarded? On the contrary, quite reverse. They had been hooted at by rowdies, snubbed by the boys, arrested by the police, reprimanded by the courts, ridiculed by some of the editors, and let alone by all of the others. If you are appearing in something that is not considered the norm, you are generally ostracized. And that is the truth, whether you are in the country, in the city, if there are personal local fads that are going on. If you appear differently or too differently than the others, you are ostracized typically. On the subject of being unfashionable, there is a book written by Louisa May Alcott in 1869 called The Old-Fashioned Girl. And it's actually very interesting because you actually read the book. Her dress isn't what's old-fashioned, it's her demeanor. And her dress is old-fashioned in the sense that it's not necessarily unfashionable in style, it's how she dresses. So the main character, Polly, dresses as a child. She's 14 years old and she still dresses as a little girl. She has a blue merino frock. Her friends, such as Fanny, who are all the same age, dress as adults. And that is why Polly is considered old-fashioned. It's not the dress itself, it's how she's wearing it and how she is being perceived by others. And there's an old grandmother character who talks quite frequently about how sensible Polly is and how wonderful it is that she's a very old-fashioned girl, because back in Grandma's day, girls appeared as children until they were 18 or so, and then they started dressing as adults. Whereas nowadays, girls are trying to grow up too fast, according to Grandmother. Which is so funny because I feel like we have the same conversation now. And it's just interesting how those sort of ideals and how children grow up and how quickly they grow up changes from year to year. And there's still a conversation that we were having in the late 1860s. But there comes a point in the story that Fanny is trying to learn some things from Polly. She has an entire wardrobe that is very unfashionable by her standards. And she doesn't know what to do with it all. So Polly comes over and Fanny explains, it's nearly May, I have hardly a decent rag to my back. Usually I just go to Mrs. O'Grady, the local dressmaker, and tell her what I want. She makes my spring wardrobe, Papa pays a bill, and there I am. But Fanny's father has come into financial difficulty, and so she doesn't have the heart to ask him for money right now, but she has to have clothes. And so she says, how will I make a spring wardrobe out of nothing? They were astonished to see how many dresses she had. There were the sofa, chair, bed, bureau were all covered. And still the servant who was burrowing in the closets kept crying, oh, here's another. And she looks at the dresses, and Fanny holds up a gray street suit that is very faded. Polly just whisked it wrong side out, showing the bright, clean fabric, and says, oh, behold your new suit. Fresh trimming and less of it will finish you off as smart as ever. And Fanny gets very doubtful. She says, I've never worn a turned dress in my life. Do you suppose people will know? Polly very sensibly says, well, if they do, they won't hurt you. Not 1 in 100 will ever think anything about your dress except that it is pretty. I've worn turned and dyed gowns all my days, and it doesn't seem to have alienated my friends. And it actually mentions, do you ever sell off your cast-off finery, as many ladies do? And Fanny says, I don't like the fashion, so I don't, essentially. She gives it away. And then they talk about possibly selling off some of her dresses so she can afford to buy some other things as well. This idea of being old-fashioned is more of a social ideal or how you're behaving as opposed to necessarily dress. But if you are not following dress, you are expected to be ostracized. And that is illustrated in stories and recollections of the time where it talks about people who are being unfashionable, and it's usually to set them apart from the rest of the characters in the story. Because as humans, we have this innate desire to be among our own kind and people who we consider to be like us. And dress is one of the ways that we determine how people are like us. It's a stupid reason, but it's still a reason nonetheless. And even going back, I know I've mentioned this before in other episodes, but when you go back to the 19th century, and yes, you do find references to women being out of fashion, you do have to figure out exactly how out of fashion are they. What makes them out of fashion? Is it just that they're not following the fads? Are they still following the basic lines of dresses? Because you still find that typically you're going to follow the basic lines of dresses. If the fashion this year is for lots of ruffles and lace, but you're a very plain person and you don't add the ruffles and the lace, you still have otherwise what we consider a fashionable gown. It's just not in the 19th century considered a fashionable gown, even though it's made the same way. And so you can absolutely not be fashionable. That's not the problem here. It's how living historians, especially, going about portraying themselves as out of fashion. Because a lot of times they like to wear, say in the 1860s, and 1840s, or even in 1850s dress and call themselves out of fashion. That's not necessarily what you would do. You would remake that gown. It may not be following the major fashion fads, and you could still be considered unfashionable, but you typically aren't going to wear the same dress as it was for a very long time. Unless, of course, you're very willing to be seen as eccentric, and when you get into that, as far as living history goes, you do need to make sure that you are documenting everything and portraying a person that was actually like that and actually did do that sort of thing. Because when you go back to, say that you're portraying a town in the 1850s that had 100,000 people in it, and you have 24 female living historians at this event portraying what would essentially be 25,000 women-ish. If 2 or 3 of those 25,000, or even 100 of those 25,000, were wearing extremely unfashionable dress, how do you get the ratios right with 24 women, unless, again, you are portraying a very specific woman that you have evidence or documentation that she did that, in which case I can understand it because you're portraying this one particular woman, but then you get to be treated. So all that to sort of clarify fashionableness versus fads, and I'm using that term, again, as a modern term because they would have considered you not following fads to be unfashionable. But it's hard for us 21st century people to get our brains wrapped around that because we think unfashionable meaning, 20, 30, 40 years out of date, wearing the same garments. And that's not necessarily what was meant when people were called old-fashioned. It could be just it could be your demeanor was old-fashioned. It could be your ideals were old-fashioned. It could be your dress was a little old-fashioned. Those are very modern terms, and I definitely wanted to point that out for anyone who was curious. Yes, we have references to women who are being old-fashioned, but to get the ratios right and actually portray that in a 21st century reenactment or living history event would be extremely difficult. The third and final myth I want to talk about today is the myth that they were all good seamstresses. I don't know why people think of this today, but I've heard it over and over and over again about how all women knew how to sew, could sew dresses, or look how talented this lady was because such and such. Often stated by people who were not sewers and therefore don't actually know a darn thing about putting fabric together to make a dress. A lot of these people think it's actually much harder than it really is and put seamstresses on almost this pedestal. And you only really need to look at a few original dresses to realize that a lot of these people had no idea what they were doing. I own original dresses and bodices, and many of them, when I look at the construction techniques, I go, well, that's not how I was taught to do it, but it works. Case in point, I have an original baby bodice with some of the sloppiest handwork I have ever seen. And there's skirts with these giant honking big facing stitches. Or I have an 1820 chemise that did 3 seams of meticulous handwork by hand when she could have done the same thing with 1 seam, as evidenced by some later chemises that I own. People just sometimes didn't know what they were doing. They needed clothes, so they did their best. And honestly, if you can't tell from the front, does it really matter? If everyone knew how to sew dresses, why are there dozens and dozens of books specifically on how to make up dresses written in plain language specifically for women who have never sewn dresses before? Why does so many household guides marketed to new wives and mothers include whole chapters just on dressmaking? How many of these books are republished year after year because the demand of the subject matter was still there? Why did Godey's Ladies Book publish a series of articles on how to make up a dress in the 1850s, 1858 to be exact, and then when subscribers kept clamoring for directions on how to make up dresses, published their own little book on making up dresses and advertised it nearly in every issue and just told women to buy the book if they really needed help putting dresses together? Some of these publications, so you don't think I'm making up, is How to Make a Dress by Mrs. A. Adams, published in 1853. There is the Handbook of Dressmaking by Mary J. Howell in 1845. The Workman's Guide by a Lady, published in 1838, also republished various times in the 1840s. Hints on Dresses for Ladies by Mrs. A. Adams in 1856. Cassie's Household Guide, first published in 1869, published all the way up again into the 1880s. There is the Young Housekeeper in 1869. The Art of Dressing Well, A Complete Guide to Economy in the year 1870, and many, many, many others. And most of them have been digitized, and you can go look them up for free online, because yes, all of the above books that I just mentioned are free online to look up on Google Books if you just search for them. And you can read all the things about dressmaking. If everybody was a good seamstress and knew how to put up dresses, there would not be this many publications on women needing to know how to put a dress together. I mention this myth because, quite frankly, I see a lot of living historians beat themselves up over their dressmaking skills. Trust me, you are probably not as bad as what I've seen on original garments. As long as you are using period materials and techniques, you probably aren't making mistakes that someone else 150 years ago has not already made. I understand that most people do not have the ability to look at originals like I do, and that's one of the reasons I share my collection when I can. But the more I look at extant garments, the more I realize that a lot of them had no idea what they were doing, but also how pretty ingenious and amazing some of these super lazy fixes of things are. 19th century seamstresses are my favorite. They don't care what things look like on the inside. As long as the dress looks good when it's being worn, no one cares about the rest of it, and that's a motto I can live by. So please, do not stress yourself out if you feel like you're making a ton of mistakes. As long as you're using period techniques, again, you are not making mistakes that someone else has not already made, and I've seen some really crappy dressmaking. And that'll about wrap this up, the third episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers. Thank you so much for listening to my second Victorian myth busting video. The next episode will be another deep dive into the layers and reconstruction of Victorian clothing, namely 1860s infant clothing. So be on the lookout for that episode coming out in a few weeks. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me or find me on Instagram or YouTube under the name Caitlin Kearns. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of One Woman is Twice Two Soldiers, and if you did, please leave a review on Spotify or YouTube and share this episode with your friends. Also, please don't hesitate to tell me which topics you would like me to cover in future episodes. Have a fantastic week, and I'll see you back here in the next episode.